Why did I say it? The question kept echoing in my mind. As I stood at the front of the room, every set of eyes in the place now focused on me. It was supposed to be a celebration, a joyous occasion, but instead, I was delivering a speech that no one expected, and no one was prepared for it. It was my wedding day, the day I was supposed to feel the most loved and supported. Instead, it had turned into the moment I decided I couldn't stay silent any longer. The audience had been waiting for the usual speeches, the sweet, heartfelt words of a bride, the thank yous, the jokes, the light-hearted references to the past. But this wasn't that kind of speech. It couldn't be. I looked out at the crowd, my parents sitting stiffly at the front, my sister Claire with her perfect smile, and then my husband, Jake, who had no idea what was coming. There was an unease in the air, a subtle tension I couldn't ignore. I had lived my whole life in the shadows of my family's expectations. Claire, always the golden child, always getting the love, the gifts, the praise. And then there was me, forever second best. It was time to end that silence, to speak the truth that had been buried for so long. My hands trembled as I gripped the microphone. I could feel the weight of the moment, the knowledge that what I was about to say would change everything. I know this isn't what you were expecting, I began, my voice a little shaky but determined, but I can't pretend anymore, not after everything that's happened. I paused, looking around the room. I could see my father's face twitch in discomfort. He always hated confrontation, but I had already made up my mind. The truth had to come out, no matter the consequences. I took a deep breath and continued. For years, I've been second best. To Claire, to all of you. I've stood by while you showered her with praise, with money, with attention, and I've been silent, thinking maybe one day I'd get my turn. But today I'm done. I've had enough. The room was completely still. No one dared to speak. I saw my mother shift uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes darting to Claire, who was now frowning, her perfect smile slipping for the first time. I'm tired of pretending I don't see how you've always treated me differently. I'm tired of being the invisible one, the afterthought. I'm done being the one who gets ignored while you celebrate her every move. I didn't even look at Claire as I said this. The words were raw, filled with years of pent-up frustration. And then it came, the truth I had been holding back. The one thing that I knew would change everything. I know about the affair, I said, my voice a little steadier now. I know about Claire's betrayal of Tom. I found out weeks ago and I didn't say anything, but I'm not going to sit here and watch you all pretend like nothing happened, like everything is fine. There it was, the bombshell, the one I knew would destroy whatever image Claire had worked so hard to maintain. I could feel the energy shift in the room as the words settled in. Some people gasped, others whispered, and Claire, she looked like she had been struck. Her face went pale, her eyes wide in shock. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to react. My father stood up quickly, his face turning red. "That's enough, Linda," he barked, his voice cracking with anger. "This is your wedding day. How dare you do this here?" But I didn't care anymore. The years of being pushed aside, the years of watching my family adore her while I was treated like a second-class citizen, it had all led to this moment. I wasn't going to back down now. I've been quiet long enough, but I'm not going to pretend anymore, I said, my voice rising, trembling with emotion. If this is what you wanted, if this is the family you wanted me to be a part of, then I don't want it. I don't want any part of it anymore. I turned to Jake, my husband, my best friend, the person who had always supported me. He looked at me with wide eyes, a mix of confusion and concern on his face. I could see him trying to process what had just happened, but all I could do was hold his gaze. "Jake, I'm sorry, but this is the truth. I couldn't keep living in the shadows." The tension in the room was suffocating. People were shifting uncomfortably, unsure of how to react. And then, my mother stood up, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. "You are ruining everything. Do you have any idea how much damage you've done? This is supposed to be your special day, and you're throwing it all away." I looked at her, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel the usual pang of guilt. I wasn't sorry. This wasn't about her or any of them. It was about me. "I'm not throwing anything away. I'm finally living for myself," I said, my voice calm despite the storm raging inside me. With that, I stepped down from the podium, feeling a sense of freedom I hadn't known in years. I had spoken my truth. Now the consequences were theirs to deal with. The aftermath of my speech was nothing short of chaotic. The wedding that had been so carefully planned, the flowers, the cake, the guest list, was suddenly eclipsed by the storm I'd unleashed. The silence that followed was deafening. My parents' faces were like stone, their anger barely contained. Claire's face had gone from shock to fury, her usual smile replaced by an expression I had never seen on her before: vulnerability. I walked away from the stage, my legs shaking, but my resolve was stronger than it had ever been. Jake stood there, rooted to the spot, his eyes wide in disbelief. He had no idea what had just happened, but I could see the questions forming in his head. And then, as I turned to him, the first thing he said, his voice barely a whisper, was enough to shake me to the core. "Linda, what the hell did you just do?" I couldn't even look him in the eye. I knew I had hurt him. I knew that what I'd done, while necessary, would cut deep, but I also knew I couldn't undo it. The truth had to come out. I had to, Jake. I've been living with this for too long. He looked at me, his expression torn between confusion and concern. But there was something else there too, something that I couldn't put my finger on. It was like he was trying to process the magnitude of what I had just revealed. But as he opened his mouth to speak, my mother's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Linda!" she yelled, storming up to me with fire in her eyes. "What in the hell is wrong with you? Do you have any idea what you've done? You've ruined everything." I turned to face her, trying to control my breathing. Her anger was almost palpable, but I wasn't afraid anymore. Not of her, not of anyone in that room. "I haven't ruined anything," I said, my voice steady. "I've finally done what I should have done years ago." "You've humiliated us," she spat. "You've embarrassed yourself in front of everyone here. Do you realize how much damage you've caused?" "Damage?" I repeated, taking a step forward. "You're talking about damage. What about all the years I've been ignored, dismissed, treated like I didn't matter?" I could see her face twist with frustration, but she didn't have a response. She knew I was right, even if she didn't want to admit it. My father, still sitting at the front, was glaring at me with so much intensity it felt like he might burst into flames. He stood up abruptly and walked over to us, his hands clenched into fists. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, his voice low and dangerous. "This is about family. This isn't just about you, or your petty grievances. You've ruined everything. You've torn this family apart. You're the one who's torn it apart." I shot back, my voice rising. "You and Mom. The favoritism. The way you've always put Claire on a pedestal while I was just an afterthought. I couldn't take it anymore. And I'm not going to pretend it doesn't hurt." "You think your sister hasn't been through anything?" he snapped. "She's the one who's had to deal with everything. You have no idea what it's like to carry the weight of this family on your shoulders." I laughed bitterly, the sound escaping before I could stop it. "Oh, please, you always say that. But what about me? What about all the times I was left to clean up the mess while you doted on Claire like she could do no wrong?" My father took a deep breath, his anger momentarily fading. "You're being unreasonable. You should have kept quiet, kept all this to yourself. But now you've crossed a line, and you're still not listening," I said, my voice trembling with the weight of everything I had to say. "I'm not crossing any line. I'm finally standing up for myself." Before my father could respond, Claire finally spoke up, her voice laced with venom. "You've ruined everything, Linda," she said, her eyes narrowed with fury. "You don't get it, do you? You've completely destroyed what little we had left." I shook my head, trying to contain the anger bubbling up inside me. "You're the one who destroyed everything. You're the one who thought you could get away with cheating on Tom, and I was supposed to just stand there and pretend like everything was fine? No, I won't be silent anymore. Not for you, not for anyone." Claire's face turned a shade of crimson I'd never seen before, her eyes filled with tears. But it wasn't from remorse. It was from the shame of being exposed. I could tell she was struggling to regain control, to hold on to the perfect image she'd crafted for herself. But it was too late. The truth was out, and there was no going back. My mother let out an exasperated sigh and turned to Jake. "You need to talk some sense into her," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "She's lost her mind." Jake took a step toward me, his brow furrowed. But before he could say anything, I spoke first. "Jake, don't. You don't have to take sides. I'm not asking you to. This isn't about anyone else. It's about me and the truth." He opened his mouth to respond, but I saw the struggle on his face. I could tell he didn't know what to do. I didn't blame him. No one could have anticipated this. Not even me. In the midst of all the chaos, I heard a loud crash coming from the other side of the room. My heart skipped a beat. I turned, and there it was. Tom, standing in the doorway, his face pale with shock. He had heard everything, and in that moment, I knew that everything was about to change. Tom stood there, frozen in the doorway, his eyes wide as he absorbed the tension in the room. His face was pale, his lips trembling with uncertainty. The weight of the moment was suffocating, and I could see his thoughts spiraling out of control. But before anyone could speak, the silence was broken by my mother's voice, sharp and venomous. "What the hell are you doing here?" she hissed, glaring at Tom like he was some sort of intruder. But it wasn't just anger in her eyes. It was fear, the kind of fear that comes from knowing that a carefully constructed lie is about to crumble. Tom took a step forward, his gaze shifting between me, my parents, and Claire. His eyes were full of confusion, but there was something else there, something like realization. He knew the truth. I heard everything," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He turned to Claire, and I could see the betrayal etched across his face. "Is it true? Were you cheating on me?" I watched as Claire's face paled, her usual confidence replaced with an almost childlike vulnerability. For the first time in years, she looked small, defenseless. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her silence was damning enough. "Tom, Claire began, her voice shaking. "I didn't want you to find out like this." "Like this?" Tom interrupted, his voice rising in anger. "You think I wanted to find out that the woman I loved, the woman I thought I was going to marry, had been lying to me for God knows how long? How could you—" Before Claire could respond, I cut her off. "You don't owe him an explanation, Claire," I said coldly. "You've already lied enough." The words hit her like a slap to the face, but I didn't care. I had spent years swallowing my anger, my disappointment, my resentment. Watching Claire lie and manipulate people, especially Tom, had been a constant source of pain for me. But now, as the truth finally came out, I couldn't help but feel a sense of justice, a strange, bitter kind of satisfaction. Claire's eyes welled up with tears, but she didn't cry. She looked at Tom, then at me, and then back to our parents, as if searching for a way to fix this, to put the pieces of her perfect world back together. But it was too late. My mother stepped in, her tone defensive. "This is absurd. Linda, you've gone too far. You've humiliated your sister, you've torn our family apart. And for what? To make yourself feel better? You're so selfish." I turned to her, my patience finally running out. "Selfish? Is that what you think? You're the one who's selfish. You've spent my whole life making me feel like I was invisible. And now you're acting like I'm the villain in all of this?" The air between us crackled with anger. My father, standing in the background, didn't say a word. He never did. It was like he was waiting for someone else to take control of the situation, but I wasn't waiting anymore. I had taken control. And no matter how much they wanted to bury the truth, I wasn't going to let them. Tom, still reeling from the shock, took another step closer. "Linda," he said, his voice calmer now, though it still held a hint of disbelief. This is so much to take in. You really think she's been cheating on me? All this time?" I nodded slowly, my eyes never leaving Claire's. "Yes, Tom. I saw it with my own eyes. I don't expect you to believe me, but it's the truth." The silence that followed was deafening. Tom's face twisted with a mixture of hurt and rage. I could see the emotional battle waging inside him. How could he have missed all the signs? How could he have been so blind to the lies right in front of him? "I never wanted to hurt you," I said to him, my voice softening, "but I couldn't keep this to myself anymore. You deserve the truth." Tom stood there for a long moment, his fists clenched at his sides. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out of the room, the door slamming behind him. The room was heavy with the weight of everything that had just been revealed. My parents were livid. Claire was crying, though whether it was from regret or anger I couldn't tell, and I was standing there still trying to process the enormity of what had just happened. The fallout from my speech wasn't just about my wedding. It was about years of lies, betrayal, and silence, and I knew, deep down, that nothing would ever be the same again. But in that moment, as I stood in the middle of the wreckage, I felt something that I hadn't felt in years: peace. I had finally spoken my truth, and while it had cost me everything, my family, my relationship with Claire, my future, I knew it was worth it. I was free. The days that followed Tom's abrupt departure were a blur. My mind raced between moments of clarity and waves of anger, confusion, and disbelief. Claire, as expected, kept her distance, retreating into the quiet corner of the house where she felt safest, away from the chaos she had helped create. My parents were no better. My father, silent as usual, avoided my gaze at every turn. My mother, on the other hand, was loud in her anger. She berated me for ruining everything and dragging the family into this mess. But I didn't care. I didn't care anymore. I had spent too many years trying to make sense of their lies, of Claire's manipulations, of the quiet, oppressive control they exerted over every part of my life. When I had spoken up at my wedding, I had done so because I couldn't stand living in the shadows anymore. And now, the aftermath, the devastation, the fallout, was my price to pay for that freedom. But it was a price I was willing to pay. A week later, after I'd received a call from Claire asking for a family meeting, I knew things were about to get even worse. The guilt, the anger, the unspoken truths were going to spill out all at once. When I walked into the living room that afternoon, the tension in the air was so thick you could cut it with a knife. My parents were already seated, Claire standing between them like she was their spokesperson, their shield. The space felt smaller, suffocating. "I'm sorry," Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't look me in the eyes. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. You know I never wanted to hurt you." Her words were empty, rehearsed. "Save it, Claire," I snapped. "You've had years to apologize. You've had years to tell me the truth. But instead, you decided to drag me through hell, make me feel like I wasn't good enough, and now you want to apologize? It's too late." My mother shot me a glare. "That's enough, Linda. Don't you dare talk to your sister like that. You've already done enough damage." "Damage?" I laughed, bitter and sharp. Damage was invisible for 28 years. Damage was watching my own sister get everything while I was left in the dark. You want to talk about damage? Let's talk about how Claire has been destroying everything in her path, lying to everyone she's ever met, including Tom. Claire's face flushed, but she didn't speak. She couldn't. Her guilt was written all over her face, a mask she couldn't hide behind anymore. I turned to my parents. "You can't protect her anymore. The truth is out, and you're just as guilty as she is. You allowed her to do all of this. You let her get away with everything while I was left cleaning up the mess, and now you want me to play nice. You want me to pretend like this is all okay?" My mother stood up, her voice rising. "You don't get it, do you, Linda? This family isn't about what's fair. It's about who you can trust. It's about loyalty." Her words dripped with venom. "Loyalty?" I repeated, my voice calm, almost detached. "Where was the loyalty when you let me fend for myself? When you made me feel like I was a burden to you all?" The silence that followed was deafening. No one spoke. No one moved. It was like the walls were closing in on me, suffocating me with all the things that had been left unsaid for so many years. And then, just as I thought the silence would consume me, the doorbell rang. I turned, confused. My parents and Claire exchanged looks, but none of them moved to answer. The ring sounded again, louder this time, more urgent. "I'll get it," I said, my voice steady. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I had no idea who was at the door, but at that moment, it didn't matter. What mattered was that I was no longer afraid. When I opened the door, my breath caught in my throat. It was Tom, standing on the doorstep, looking just as lost and broken as I felt. His eyes met mine, and for the briefest moment, the world around us seemed to disappear. "I needed to see you," he said, his voice hoarse, his words heavy with meaning. "I know I left. I know I walked away, but I don't know what to do anymore. I can't just forget everything. I can't pretend I didn't hear what I heard. But I also can't stop thinking about you, about everything we had before this." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind. Everything I'd gone through, the lies, the betrayal, the rage. But through it all, a part of me still cared. A part of me still wanted to believe that we could fix things. "Tom," I began, my voice breaking slightly. "I don't know if we can fix this. I don't know if I even want to anymore." He stepped closer, his hand reaching for mine. "Please, Linda. I'm sorry. I was blind, but now I see everything. I want to make things right. I don't want to lose you." I looked down at his hand, the warmth of his touch igniting something deep inside me. But at the same time, I knew this wasn't the way forward. Not anymore. I had fought too hard to let my past define me, to let my family's lies and mistakes control my future. "I've already lost so much, Tom," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "and I don't think I can keep fighting for something that isn't mine to fight for anymore." The door closed behind me, and I stood there for a long moment, listening to the sound of my own heartbeat, wondering if I had just made the biggest mistake of my life. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. I had made peace with who I was, and that was all I could ask for. The days after Tom's visit were nothing short of surreal. The silence in the house was deafening, yet the weight of every word left unsaid felt heavier with each passing minute. I had made my decision, but part of me still wasn't sure if it was the right one. Was I really ready to let go of everything? Was I ready to break the family ties that had been strangling me for years? I had spent so long being the good daughter, the silent one, trying to appease everyone around me, but that was no longer who I was. It had taken years of pain and betrayal for me to finally realize that my happiness didn't depend on anyone else's approval, least of all my family's. But the more I pushed away from them, the more they came after me. It started with small messages from Claire, filled with guilt and excuses, trying to explain away her actions. My parents, too, couldn't stay silent for long. My mom called me, her voice shaking, begging me to understand that everything they did was for my own good. I could almost hear her tears through the phone, but I wasn't moved anymore. It wasn't enough. Then came the bombshell. A few days after I told Claire and my parents that I needed space, I received an email from my father's lawyer. I opened it with trembling hands, expecting another round of accusations or threats, but what I found made my blood run cold. The email detailed a lawsuit, a claim that I had caused irreparable harm to my father's business through my actions at the wedding. It was the kind of legal threat designed to intimidate, to silence someone into submission. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so predictable. They had gone this far. They had orchestrated this entire scheme to make me feel small, to make me question myself. But this time I wasn't going to back down. Not again. I forwarded the email to my lawyer immediately, and I knew what I had to do. This wasn't just about a family feud anymore. This was about taking back control of my life. The next few days were a blur of legal jargon, calls with my lawyer, and a cold, detached sense of determination. I wasn't going to let them get away with this. I wasn't going to let them ruin me any longer. I made the decision to fight back, publicly. I wasn't going to let them drag my name through the mud. If they wanted a war, I'd give them one. On the day I filed my countersuit, I sent an email to every single person in my family, detailing the truth. I laid bare the years of manipulation, the lies, the games they played at my expense. I exposed Claire for what she was, a liar, a manipulator, a cheat. I sent screenshots of her texts with Tom, the ones where she mocked me and made fun of my relationship. I included details of how my parents had enabled her, always choosing her over me, treating me like I was invisible. I didn't care about the fallout. I was done trying to please them. I was done pretending that everything was okay when it wasn't. But what I didn't anticipate was how the world would respond. Within hours of sending the emails, I started receiving messages, texts, phone calls, even posts on social media from people I didn't even know, expressing their support. It was as if a weight had been lifted, and suddenly, the truth was out. My family tried to silence me with their lawyer, but I had already made my stand. I had already won. The media got hold of the story, and it wasn't long before the narrative spread. My family's dirty laundry was out in the open, and people were taking sides. It was no longer just about me. It was about standing up to the injustices I had endured for years, and people respected that. Claire, of course, was furious. She called me, screaming down the phone, accusing me of ruining her life. My mother sent me a long, tear-filled message, begging me to take everything down, to end this before it's too late. But I didn't even read them. I didn't care. What I hadn't expected, though, was how Tom would react. The night after everything had blown up, I received a knock on my door. I opened it to find him standing there, his face pale, his eyes wide with shock. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't know any of this, but I'm here now, and I want to fix things. I want to be with you. I stood there for a long moment, staring at him. My heart was torn in two. A part of me wanted to run into his arms, to tell him everything would be okay. But the other part, the stronger part, knew that I couldn't keep making the same mistakes. I couldn't keep allowing myself to be a second choice, to be part of someone else's drama. "I don't think I can be with you anymore," I said, the words feeling foreign but true. "I've spent so much of my life living in your shadow, in my family's shadow, but I can't do it anymore, Tom. I need to find my own way, and I can't do that if I keep holding on to the past." His face crumpled, the pain in his eyes almost unbearable. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I love you. I always have. I loved you too, I replied softly. But love isn't enough to fix everything. Not anymore. As he turned and walked away, I felt a sense of finality wash over me. I had made my choice. And it wasn't for him. It wasn't for anyone but myself. It's funny how, sometimes, life only makes sense when you stop trying to force it into some neat, perfect shape. I used to believe that if I just played by the rules, if I was just good enough, quiet enough, patient enough, everything would fall into place. But the truth is, I had been living in a prison of my own making, pretending that if I just kept my head down, if I just kept swallowing the bitter pills they handed me, it would all turn out fine in the end. But it didn't. It never did. As the weeks passed since I took that first step, exposing the ugly truths about my family to the world, the dust started to settle. I hadn't expected everything to be wrapped up neatly with a bow. There were still days where I found myself questioning my choices, wondering if I had gone too far. But then, I'd think about the years I had spent being overlooked, silenced, manipulated, and I knew, without a doubt, that there was no going back. I had finally broken free, and that freedom was worth everything. The lawsuit threat from my father's lawyer had been dropped almost immediately. The moment they realized I wasn't going to back down, wasn't going to be intimidated, they had no choice but to retreat. It was over. The years of manipulation, the games, the lies, it was all over. And then, the unexpected happened. I received a letter from my mother. It wasn't a legal letter, like the ones I had grown used to. No, this one was personal. It wasn't full of accusations or demands. It was a simple letter written in her own hand. Dear Linda, I know I've made mistakes. I know I've hurt you more than I ever realized. I never wanted you to feel like you weren't enough, like you didn't matter. But I see now that I failed you. I let my own jealousy and insecurities control me, and I treated you like you were a second-class citizen in our family. For that, I am sorry. I know that saying sorry doesn't fix everything. I know that I can't undo the years of damage I've caused. But I want to try. I want to make things right. If you're willing, I'd like to start over. I'll do whatever it takes. But the decision is yours. With love, Mom. I stared at the letter for a long time, my hands trembling. It wasn't an apology I had expected, nor one that I had ever thought I'd get. My mother had never been good at showing vulnerability, and this letter was raw, genuine. But did I believe her? Did I believe that the woman who had hurt me so deeply, who had let me down time and time again, was suddenly capable of change? I wasn't sure, but what I did know was that I had come to a place of peace within myself. I didn't need my family's approval anymore. I didn't need their love to define my worth. I had built a life for myself, one that was full of possibilities, and I wasn't going to let anyone, no matter who they were, take that from me. I wrote back to her. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't a dramatic reconciliation, but it was honest. I told her that I appreciated her apology. I told her that I had no ill will toward her anymore, but that I couldn't just pretend the past hadn't happened. I wasn't ready to forgive her yet, but maybe in time I could learn to. Her response came a week later. A short text message. Thank you for being honest with me. I understand if you need more time. I'll always be here, Linda. And that was it. I didn't call. I didn't try to fix everything. Instead, I took a long walk outside, feeling the warm sun on my face. The weight that had been crushing me for years seemed to lift, bit by bit. The power to choose, to make my own decisions, was mine now. It was all up to me, and I didn't have to explain myself to anyone anymore. But there was still one last thing I had to do. I called Jake. We hadn't spoken much since the mess with Tom and my family, and I knew that I owed him more than just an apology. I owed him the truth, the whole truth. I couldn't move forward without him knowing how much I had been struggling, how I had been running from my past instead of confronting it. When I saw his name light up my phone, my heart skipped a beat. It had been a long time since I had felt this way, so uncertain, but so hopeful, all at once. Jake, I said when he answered, I need to talk. We met at the coffee shop down the street, a place that had become our quiet sanctuary. I could feel the tension in the air as we sat down, but this time, it wasn't the old familiar tension, the one that came from avoiding the things we didn't want to say. This time, it was different. It was the tension of finally facing everything. I don't know if I can ever make up for the things I've done, but I want to try, I said, looking him in the eye. I've been running from my past, from my family, from the truth, but I can't do it anymore. I can't keep pretending that everything's fine when it's not. Jake took a long sip of his coffee, his eyes softening. You don't have to make up for anything, Linda. You don't owe me anything. You've been through so much. But if you're asking me to stay, I'm here. Always. And for the first time in a long time, I let myself believe that maybe everything would be okay. Not perfect, but okay. I didn't need my family's validation. I didn't need anyone's approval except my own. I had made it this far, on my own terms. And for the first time in my life, I was proud of the woman I had become.